So I'm really grateful to be invited to speak on this particular topic. It's a topic that really interests me, but it's one that I don't get asked to speak about that often. In fact, I think this is the first time I've actually been asked to speak about NAR and Islam, and something that has long fascinated me, but I don't haven't been able to put together my thoughts before. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Um, I'm gonna introduce something quickly, and then we're gonna do a lot of background, just because this is a confusing movement, and in order to even understand how they approach a topic like Islam or eschatology, we got to do quite a bit of background. But I want to introduce you first to a man named Micah Beckwith. Micah Beckwith is the lieutenant governor of the state of Indiana. He is also a pastor in a church that is linked to the New Apostolic Reformation, and which is an evangelical movement. We'll just kind of talk about that, and we'll get into much more depth on the NAR in just a minute. But so I have here a tweet that he put out in June of 2025. So this is almost over a year and a half, almost 2 years into Israel's decimation of Gaza, as the people of Gaza are starving and homeless and displaced. And he texted out or tweeted out, Indiana stands with our Jewish friends, and as lieutenant governor, Israel will always have my unwavering support, and then an Israeli flag and an American flag. So pretty clear, I think, that Mike Beckwith is a Christian Zionist, right? Which is to say he's a Christian who supports Israel for Christian theological reasons. So perhaps Micah Beckwith, I mean, he seems very interested in engaging with Jewish people and with Israel. Maybe he's into interreligious dialogue. Let's see what he has to say about Islam.
We've seen this movement to eradicate hate in our culture. That is the worst thing we could do. You know, the Bible talks about how God hates certain things. And when we say we want to eradicate hate, think about this. We're actually saying we want to eradicate a characteristic of God. And hate is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. And so when I talk about this, I say, guys, we need to, in Indiana, we need to hate certain things. If radical jihadi mindset starts coming into our state, I'm going to hate it, and I'm going to hate it with everything that I am. And I'm going to call on others to hate it because I hate Islam. It's a demonic death call. Now, I love Muslims because they make great Christians when Jesus gets a hold of them, but I hate Islam. And we need to be okay with hating again.
Not so much of an interreligious dialogue aficionado, apparently. So this is more representative of the kind of rhetoric you hear from these New Apostolic Reformation circles when it comes to Islam. Very pro-Israel, they would say pro-Jewish. And yet, when it comes to Islam, you get this language of hate, this language of demons, of death cult. So I'm going to make the case that this is not just generic evangelical Christian Zionism and Islamophobia. I think there are, it's part of evangelical Christian Zionism and Islamophobia, but I think there are particular styles and strands of this stuff within the New Apostolic Reformation that have become very, very important. And especially when we look at how things are playing out right now. Before we get into all that, though, let me try to locate what we're even talking about when we talk about the NAR, or the New Apostolic Reformation. And this is something for those who've read my book, this will be very familiar, but I have a different model for mapping and understanding American Christianity. And in this model, it's kind of four quadrants, and there are two axes. One axis is the question, are they denominational? Yes or no? And of course, denominations are how Protestants, especially American Protestants, have historically solved the problem of Protestant schismatic nature, right? That Protestants are always fighting with each other and we break apart. But denominations become this way of holding traditions, of carrying traditions down through the decades and even the centuries. Denominations bind churches together, and they have bylaws and committees and semi-democratic governance. So that's one question, yes or no, denominational. And the second question is, are they charismatic? And here, I'm not using charismatic in the kind of generic sense of having a magnetic personality. Talking about kind of this in Christian terms. And I'm going to define charismatic here as a spirituality built around recapturing the miraculous ethos of the early church. Oftentimes, when we talk about charismaticism, you'll hear people talking about speaking in tongues, people talking about modern prophecy, gifts of the Spirit, these sorts of things. But I think if we're trying to kind of understand how it functions for people who are charismatic, they are trying to recapture something that they believe the early church had that the rest of the church has lost over the centuries. Now, when you put kind of American Christianity into this grid, the first quadrant would be yes to denominational and no to charismatic. And this is where I think most American Christians think American Christianity is centered. Most Catholics would fit in this category. Most mainline Protestants, the kind of historic and traditional Protestant denominations of the US. I mean, to be a mainline Protestant is to belong to one of these mainline denominations. Many historically black Protestants also, especially for those denominations and traditions that go back before the Civil War, before the rise of Pentecostalism, that they would belong more in that kind of first quadrant. And then I would put in here what I would call classical evangelicals, Southern Baptists, Presbyterian Church of America, Evangelical Free, kind of these traditions largely that came over from Europe and settled in the US, but these kind of older evangelical denominations. Now, the second quadrant really speaks to, I think, a tendency that we find a lot in the United States, but really around the world. This is where you have the intersection of non-denominational governance, but non-charismatic spirituality. And again, Protestants tend to be very schismatic, constantly bickering and fighting. And there's a very old American impulse to set aside denominations in favor of authentic biblical Christianity. It goes back at least to the early 19th century with the Churches of Christ. And today, I would call these folks mostly independent evangelicals. So these are Bible churches, kind of often post-fundamentalist, if that word means anything to folks. Often independent Baptists. They tend to have a little bit more of a Baptist style of governance. And then the third quadrant is where we would find the folks that we call Pentecostals. So this is yes to denominations and yes to charismatic, right? And so this is where you'd find the Assemblies of God or the Church of God in Christ. A lot of these denominations in the US came out of the Azusa Street revivals in the beginning of the 20th century. You also have a burgeoning movement of charismatic Catholics in the US, but even burgeoning much more around the world, where you have kind of a Pentecostal style spirituality blending with Catholic belonging and identity. This is especially growing in Latin America and in parts of Africa. And then you do have a few charismatic mainline Protestant churches. It's a kind of a dying breed, but there still are some in the U.S. And so in this quadrant, they're taking that energy of charismaticism, that kind of excitement of charismaticism, but containing it within the bureaucracy of denominations and traditions. And then the fourth quadrant is where you have this charismatic spirituality meeting non-denominational style governance. And this is a group that we in the scholarly world refer to as the independent charismatics, independent here being a synonym for non-denominational. Amazing growth in this sector since the 1970s or 1980s. And this is kind of the cutting edge of American Christianity, at least in terms of technology and popularity and all. Now, this is a group that is intrinsically difficult to measure because they're non-denominational, right? And to be non-denominational is in some ways to say you don't have a tradition. You don't belong to an older tradition. And surveys don't generally ask in the US about whether somebody's charismatic or not. And it's kind of hard to kind of find where exactly that line is between charismatic and not. So very hard to kind of pin down in the numbers. But I would just observe that when we talk about American evangelicalism, there are evangelicals in every one of these quadrants. Not everyone in these quadrants is evangelical, but there are evangelicals in each one of these, right? So quadrant one evangelicals tend to be kind of the evangelical establishment, the older traditions, the more kind of institutionally hefty forms of evangelicalism tied to these denominations. Quadrant two would be these kind of post-fundamentalist schismatics, the kind of non-denominational folks who don't get along with very many other people and just have their own kind of thing going on. Quadrant three would be the Pentecostals, these kind of measured legacy charismatics. And then quadrant four are these upstart, unregulated charismatics. And for the rest of the lecture, I'd like to focus in on these fourth quadrant evangelicals, these independent charismatics, because that's where the NAR resides, and that is really the rising movement within U.S. politics as well. So what do we mean when we say independent charismatic? What does this look like? How do you know it if you see it? Well, this is the fastest growing segment of American Christianity, and it's also the fastest growing segment of global Christianity. The Center for the Study of World Christianity at Gordon Conwell Seminary estimates that in 1970, globally, there were about 44 million independent charismatics. By 2020, that's what this chart is showing here, they were up to 312 million globally. So you're talking about a segment of Christianity that's roughly doubling in size every 20 years right now, and has been pretty consistently for the last 50, 60 years. It's a segment of Christianity that's ethnically diverse and globally connected. This is not merely kind of, again, denominations tend to kind of operate within national boundaries. These folks don't have those boundaries. And so what you have are these kind of far-flung global networks that bind together churches and leaders around the world. And so what comes out of it is this kind of very ethnically diverse mix of people. These are folks who believe in modern prophecy and have these ecstatic spiritual practices. And let me say a word about modern prophecy because it's very important. Most Christians believe in what we could call biblical prophecy, that there are passages in the Bible that allude to events in the future that have not yet been fulfilled. For instance, I would say it is creedal Christianity to say that Jesus is coming back. That's a biblical prophecy. Now, these folks believe in that. The independent charismatics believe in biblical prophecy, but they also believe in modern prophecy, that there are actual prophets who walk the earth today, who are part of the church, who, like the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, receive direct words from God and then deliver those words to individuals or to leaders or to nations. So that's different than kind of just a biblical prophecy belief. These are also folks who have a strong emphasis on what is talked about as spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare, in very simple terms, is just the idea that there are angels and demons, real angels and demons, in this kind of invisible spiritual realm that are battling for control over the earth. And those battles affect Christians, but in turn, Christians can affect those battles. That's what we talk about, the spiritual warfare. A lot of this comes out of the epistle to the Ephesians. And so the idea is that Christians can help beat back the forces of the demonic realm through spiritual practices like prayer or singing worship songs, or maybe at the more extreme end, performing an exorcism. That's spiritual warfare. Now, these folks believe in that, but they also ramp it up to kind of a very intense degree. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Again, because they're independent, they are not tied to any denominational or accountability structure. So things tend to be pretty freewheeling here and pretty kind of moving in all directions at once. But when people hear non-denominational, they often think that, oh, it's unstructured. But this is actually quite structured. It's just structured in a very different way. What you have, what holds together this independent charismatic space is this network of global leaders, these celebrities in charismatic media who are all friends. I mean, there are hundreds, probably even thousands of members of this kind of celebrity class around the world now who are hanging out at conferences together, endorsing each other's books, doing big kind of speaking gigs at each other's churches. And so they're very relationally connected, they're not institutionally connected. And I sometimes refer to this as the Silicon Valley of the American church. Very innovative, very tech savvy. I mean, these folks are prolifically online, very good at navigating social media. Not a lot of regulation, not a lot of accountability, more kind of a move fast and break things kind of mentality. And so a very important thought leader in this independent charismatic world was a guy named C. Peter Wagner. And Wagner was a seminary professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is my alma mater. He was a professor in what was called church growth at the time. This was in the 1970s, 1980s. And church growth was just the idea that you could take the data of the social sciences and blend it with evangelical theology and produce growth. And the church growth movement was very influential on the rise of the megachurch movement that is still an ongoing thing today. Rick Warren, the famous pastor of Saddleback Church, who wrote The Purpose-Driven Church and The Purpose-Driven Life, he did his doctoral work under Peter Wagner at Fuller Seminary. So those are the kind of people that are studying with Peter Wagner. Now, in the 1990s, though, Peter Wagner became fascinated with this independent charismatic space. And he started kind of studying it and focusing on it. He became very interested in these ideas of spiritual warfare. And he wound up actually adopting this kind of independent charismatic spirituality and identity for himself. And he came to believe that he was a modern day apostle, that God had gifted him. This is a very common belief within this kind of independent charismatic world, that there are modern day apostles and prophets. And he came to believe that he was a modern day apostle and that God was going to inaugurate a global revival through Peter Wagner and his mentees, and establish Christian dominion over societies. And so he takes a bunch of ideas from this independent charismatic world, blends them together, and titles this kind of bundle the New Apostolic Reformation. And in 1999, he retires from Fuller Seminary and goes and starts building a set of networks that he also calls the New Apostolic Reformation, gathering together a bunch of his mentees and other leaders who are interested in being apostles and prophets. And they start building a set of networks with names like the Eagles Vision Apostolic Team, which was Wagner's kind of personal mentoring circle, or the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, which is kind of a gathering of prophets, or the International Coalition of Apostles. And so again, these networks they exist, but they're not institutional. You're not going to find a membership database. It's more kind of relational networks, but hundreds of independent charismatic pastors and other leaders, worship leaders, revivalists join Wagner's networks in the late 1990s into the 2000s because they want to try their hand at being an apostle or prophet. They want to experiment with these ideas of spiritual warfare that Peter Wagner and his fellows are driving. So I want to introduce you briefly to how this theology works because it's unusual compared to how a lot of forms of Protestantism operate. So again, fundamental premise for them is that there are modern day apostles and prophets being commissioned and empowered by the Holy Spirit right now to bring about a global end times revival. It's something they believe very fervently in, that there will be a great revival at the end of time. Now, they also have a pretty different interpretation from how most evangelicals understand the Great Commission, Matthew chapter 28, right? So in Matthew 28, Jesus tells the apostles after his resurrection, go into the world and to spread the gospel, like preach the gospel, and disciple the nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and I am with you always, right? And so the most Christians throughout history have interpreted that passage as being about Jesus sending the apostles to all the peoples of the world, right? Ta ethne, all the nations of the world. The NAR and other people in their kind of vein interpret this as God commanded apostles to disciple nations, that the nation itself becomes the object of discipleship, not merely the people, but the nation itself. Well, how do you disciple a nation? What does that look like? Well, pretty early on in this NAR movement, along comes a guy named Lance Wallnau. And Wallnau is an apostle. He's also a prophet, and he claims that he has received a special prophecy from God called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And this becomes the political theology of the NAR. And the Seven Mountain Mandate is this prophetically revealed system for how to disciple a nation. How do you do that? How do you achieve Christian supremacy over all the areas of a nation? And Wallnau says, and this is actually drawing on some very old strands of Calvinism, but he's kind of updating that and putting it into a more charismatic frame. And he says there are 7 arenas of authority in society: religion, family, education, media, government, arts and entertainment, business. And every one of those is a mountain. And the top of that mountain in every society is either controlled by Satan and the demons or by God and the Christians. And so the mandate part, the commandment, is to go and conquer the 7 mountains, to drive out the demons, to take over positions of authority and power in society so that Christian influence can flow down into society. So it's kind of a top-down model of reforming society. You either take over the mountains yourselves or you ally yourselves with leaders in education, leaders in government who will work with you in order to have Christian influence flow down into society. Now, the problem from their perspective is right now, the 7 mountains in just about every society on the earth are currently held by demons and Satan. And so the world is infested with demons in the NAR vision. And hierarchies of demons. And so the application of all of this is that the apostles and prophets must wage a grand spiritual war in order to defeat the hierarchy of demons, in order to bring about this global revival, in order to take dominion over the nation. So that's how this all kind of fits together from their perspective. Now, this stuff was kind of fringy and weird in the 1990s into the 2000s. And it was popular in charismatic circles, but it was not considered mainstream evangelicalism in any respect. This was stuff that was happening kind of in the charismatic hinterlands. But it just so happened, as Donald Trump entered presidential politics in 2015, in June of 2015, he declares his candidacy, rides down the golden escalator at Trump Tower. And it's also that summer that he turns to his own most trusted spiritual advisor, Paula White Cain. And Paula White Cain was not part of Wagner's networks, but she is an independent charismatic person. She's participating in a lot of the same kind of strands and streams of thought as the NAR is. And she's a televangelist. She's a megachurch pastor. She has called herself an apostle. She's a prosperity gospel preacher. And she's Donald Trump's trusted confidant. And he asks her to be his liaison to the evangelicals. He knows that if he's going to win the Republican primary, he has to win evangelicals. And so he asks Paula White Cain to be his outreach person to the evangelicals. Except she's not a conventional evangelical. She's an independent charismatic, kind of more the kind of wild-eyed ecstatic style of evangelical. And so she starts reaching out to the kind of people that she knows, including people like Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy. And they set up a series of meetings with Trump in the fall of 2015 at Trump Tower with a bunch of these independent charismatic leaders, televangelists, megachurch pastors, apostles, prophets. And Wallnau is in these meetings. And he claims in the first meeting that he has with Donald Trump, he receives a prophecy about Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is a Cyrus, an Isaiah 45 Cyrus. This is a reference to the chapter 45 of the prophet Isaiah, where Cyrus, this Persian emperor, who was the one who sent the Jewish people back from exile, is referred to as a Mashiach, as the word in Hebrew where we get the term Messiah. He's a savior of Israel. He's not a godly person. Cyrus is not godly. He's a pagan. He's a heathen. But God uses Cyrus to deliver God's people. And so Wallnau is saying Donald Trump is that kind of a figure. He's not a godly man, but God has an anointing on him for a purpose of saving conservative Christians from cultural exile. And so when Trump wins the election, I mean, Wallnau writes an entire book about the right that comes out right before the 2016 election, and he titles it "God's Chaos Candidate," claiming that Donald Trump is this prophesied president for the United States. But as Trump wins in 2016 and invites Paula White Cain to kind of set up an evangelical advisory circle, she brings in a bunch of these NAR leaders to populate these advisory circles, these evangelical advisory circles around Trump. These are the people, if you've seen these photos or videos of Christian leaders praying over Trump with laying hands on him, those are the people in those photos. The vast majority of them are independent charismatics, and a handful of them are New Apostolic Reformation leaders. And so the New Apostolic Reformation, they begin to kind of propagandize Donald Trump, spiritually propagandize him, using these prophecies. And Wallnau kind of offers one of the first prophecies, this kind of Cyrus prophecy. But over time, hundreds of these prophecies about Donald Trump have accumulated from the NAR and other independent charismatic prophets. But they also use these paradigms of spiritual warfare to say Donald Trump, because he's God's candidate, because he is the one that God wants to use, he is on the side of the angels. And if you oppose Trump, you must be on the side of the demons, right? That's the binary. And so Donald Trump is God's asset on the earth, and they begin to issue all these prophecies and spiritual warfare pronunciations about Donald Trump. And by the time of the 2020 election, so after 4 years of this, there are hundreds of these prophecies that have accumulated. And almost universally across the board, these prophecies are saying Donald Trump is destined to win the 2020 election. Now, the NAR believes that, yes, God wills certain things, but those things don't necessarily come to pass. So they have a belief in what they call open theism, that that God wants things, but then the church has to enact those things. God does not perfectly know the future. And God desires certain things, but then Satan and the demons push back on those things and try to thwart the will of God. And so they believed that God wanted Donald Trump to win the 2020 election, but that the demons would try to push back and prevent him from winning, and that they would have to do spiritual warfare, an epic spiritual battle, in order to get Donald Trump across the finish line. Now, when Donald Trump refused to concede the 2020 election. He lost in November of 2020, refuses to concede. And all these prophets start saying, hey, look, we're not recanting our prophecies. God still wants Donald Trump to win. This election is not resolved yet. And we need to do spiritual warfare in order to put him back in office. And so the NAR leaders launch a massive spiritual warfare campaign. They'll often refer to the apostles and prophets as generals of spiritual warfare. And they have this mentality that they are the ones who can see into the spiritual realm and lead, guide mass campaigns of spiritual warfare. And so they start orchestrating this through podcasts and televangelism shows, highlighting all of these prophecies, stirring up their followers and saying, we need to stand with Donald Trump. We need to fight against the corruption and this demonic conspiracy that wants to keep him out of office. And we are going to put him back in office by the power of God. And this becomes the spirituality of January 6th. I have tracked more than 60 independent charismatic leaders who were in Washington, D.C. for the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. Many of them were in the crowds surrounding the Capitol leading spiritual warfare. Seven of them have faced criminal prosecution because they went into the Capitol or participated. And the folks who are circled in red are the ones who are closely associated with the NAR. So, and in fact, at least 5 members of Wagner's inner circle, the Eagles Vision Apostolic team, were there that day. And that's what my book is about. The Violent Taken by Force is really about how these folks shaped the spirituality of Christian Trumpism, the spirituality of January 6th, and how they were directly involved in mobilizing and leading that day. This stuff has continued long after January 6th. So my book really kind of ends with January 6th. These folks powered Donald Trump back into office and continued to support him, continued to propagandize him, continued to prophesy about him during the Biden presidency from 21 to beginning of 25. And they helped Trump win the 2024 election. And they are still very loyal allies, especially around these Trump advisory circles around Paula White-Cain. So Paula White-Cain is now the director of the White House Faith Office, has a very, very important and powerful role in Washington, D.C. She has become the gatekeeper for all religious leaders around Donald Trump. And you see them cycling through these groups of religious leaders who meet with Trump. Often there's a kind of nucleus, a core group of his evangelical advisors, but then they keep bringing in new folks. So a lot of so you have, this was from this past December. Once again, Paula White-Cain and Lance Wallnau in the Oval Office now, praying over Donald Trump, speaking with him. But you also have this whole crop of other independent charismatic and next generation NAR leaders who are also the people that I try to keep track of, also meeting with Trump, also getting embedded within American politics and American government. So as that was all the throat clearing to finally get to, let's talk about the NAR and Islam and how NAR eschatology works. So of course, when we're talking about eschatology, right, we're talking about the theology of the end of the world, how people envision the end of the world. And NAR eschatology, like a lot of NAR theology, is very amorphous and eclectic and difficult to pin down. If you're coming from a more kind of systematic theology background or mentality that wants to kind of say it's either premillennialism or postmillennialism, that's not how they think. That's not how this kind of community thinks. They don't prioritize being systematic or overall coherent, right? They are revivalists. They are prophets and apostles who bring new revelation into the world. And so they don't, it's not systematizable in any neat or clear way. That said, there are certain themes and certain core prophecies that recur across NAR eschatological discourse. And some of those themes are things like the emotion of their eschatology is very optimistic. They're very hopeful for a victorious, global, spirit-filled Christianity that will precede Christ's return. Now, if you're familiar with kind of the legacy kind of eschatology of American evangelicalism, at least in the 20th century, is dispensationalism. And dispensationalism is very pessimistic, right? This is rapture theology, right? We need Jesus to come back and fix the world because the world is just getting worse and worse. We're waiting on the rapture, right? That's not the NAR. They are not dispensationalists, but they're also not quite fully postmillennial. They're not quite fully imagining Christians taking over the whole world and building the kingdom of God on earth. So you have books like this one from Harold Eberle called "Victorious Eschatology." This is I think that's a good phrase for understanding NAR eschatology. Victorious eschatology. Now, in terms of tactics, so as I tried to explain, right? So they believe both in spiritual warfare and open theism, right? So the future is not fully predetermined. God wants certain things. God wills certain things. God reveals God's will to the prophets, but then the church has to enact God's will through spiritual warfare, battling back these demonic forces that oppose and want to thwart God's will. That's very important for their end time eschatology. So it's not a specific timeline per se. It's more a kind of orientation instead of goals, and all of it framed through this kind of battle and combat metaphor. The mechanism of all of this is this global end times revival. And sometimes they'll refer to that as the billion soul harvest. There are a lot of prophecies in their community that refer to a billion people converting in the midst of this great revival. And so they'll often talk about the billion soul harvest or the third great awakening. But that's going to be led by these apostles and prophets. And one of the goals of their eschatology, and this might sound a little strange, is they're obsessed with the book of Ephesians. And so in Ephesians chapter 2, where the author of Ephesians is trying to work through this kind of Jewish Gentile kind of quagmire in the early church, there's this reference to God creating one new man out of Jew and Gentile. And the NAR believes that's a prophecy of the end of time, of the merging together of Messianic Judaism, this movement that identifies as both Jewish and Christian, with the Gentile apostles. And the Messianic Judaism overlaps with the NAR to a great degree. There are a lot of Messianic leaders who are also NAR leaders. And so they believe that this is one of these eschatological fulfillments, will be this kind of end times Christianity that is both Jewish and Gentile. And then the second goal that they are often pursuing is the idea of politically fulfilling this Great Commission mandate, as they understand it, to disciple the nations, to conquer the seven mountains and many different nations, to make many nations Christian nations that will protect Christians at the end of time. Now, obviously, they're also very into Christian Zionism. But it's not a kind of conventional style of Christian Zionism. In fact, this is true across the independent charismatic sector. They're very, because of the proximity of Messianic Judaism, they're very interested in Jewish symbols, Jewish rituals, and they'll often appropriate those symbols and rituals for their own spiritual practices and spiritual warfare. So here are a couple of women. These women are not Jewish, but they are blowing shofars. They are wearing talit, the Jewish prayer shawl, and they are blowing their shofars outside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th as part of spiritual warfare. They believe they're summoning the armies of heaven to battle against the demonic forces that have taken over the Capitol. Similarly, the NAR apostles will sometimes hold big signing ceremonies and kind of commissioning ceremonies where they say that this one was actually in Israel in 2015. Jewish and Gentile apostles getting together to try to accomplish this one new man prophecy. And they believe that Israel has a crucial role to play in that. They'll also, when they think about modern prophecy, they'll read the Bible in very interesting ways. And so there are passages in the Hebrew Bible that say that there's a specific ceremony that has to take place for the purification of the priests who will serve in the temple that involves the sacrifice of a red heifer. Well, the problem is red heifers are kind of extinct. And so some of these charismatic folks, actually a billionaire in Texas, wound up investing all this money to kind of re-engineer red heifers, ship them to Israel by plane, actually, and then sacrifice them so that they could create the ashes for this temple ceremony to rebuild the third temple. They are actively trying to rebuild the third temple and set the kind of stages for that. And of course, the government of Israel is very aware of who are the ardent Christian Zionists out there. And Netanyahu has become very close friends with Paula White-Cain, many of the NAR leaders. Here he is meeting in January, but with John Hagee and a bunch of other Christian Zionists, Mike Huckabee, but also a lot of Trump's evangelical advisors, including a bunch of NAR leaders. In fact, there's an organization called the Israel Allies Foundation in DC. And this is a Christian organization, a Christian Zionist organization. And since 2020, every year they put out a list of the top 50 Christian allies of Israel. You can think of this as kind of a who's who or a ranked list of the most influential Christian Zionists in the world. And I've just kind of grabbed a bunch of these are all the people who've made those lists who are in the advisory circles around Donald Trump. And the people with the red circles are NAR leaders. So frankly, what has happened, what Donald Trump has done, part of the way that he has structured his own administration and these evangelical advisory circles, is Donald Trump has surrounded himself with Christian Zionist extremists. People who are some of the most extreme Christian Zionists in the world are the Christians who surround Donald Trump and advise him. Now, what about Islam, though? Well, this is a charismatic, independent charismatic guy in Australia named Andrew Sedra. I think this is very much what you heard even in the little Micah Beckwith clip, right? Islam is a death cult. Allah is a demon. Muhammad is a false prophet. That is kind of when they think about Islam, that is how they think about it. But because NAR eschatology is not systematized or fully distinct from the rest of their apostolic-led spiritual warfare and revivalism, Islam becomes this polyvalent negative symbol that plays multiple roles in their rhetoric and their theology. Now, and this is an important point to make, because I think you also heard this in the little Beckwith clip. NAR rhetoric often demonizes Islam as a religion, quite literally demonizes it, and as a system, while notionally affirming love and concern for individual Muslims who are victimized by Islam. And this parallels the way that they view all people that they perceive as demon-possessed. We love the people. We just hate the demons that hold them in control. And we have to fight the demons. We've got to get the demons out of them so that they can all come and agree with us. And so the relative global size of Islam means that it is often framed as a rival to Christian dominance. If their goal is Christian dominance over the world, Islam is the main threat in their system. Also secularism, but Islam is kind of the religious threat. So some common themes from NAR rhetoric about Islam, and I'm going to give some samples of this in just a minute. They'll talk about Islam as a demonic force concentrated in certain U.S. locales around mosques or in places with large Muslim communities that have to be exorcised. You have to exorcise this demon of Islam. Sometimes they'll talk about Islam as a modern manifestation of an ancient territorial spirit. Territorial spirit in their lingo is like a general demon, like a commander level demon who can control physical territory. And they'll often talk about the territorial spirit of the Prince of Persia, a reference from the book of Daniel, that holds back revival in the Middle East. And then they'll talk about Islam as a subversive anti-American movement that aims to disrupt the U.S. alliance with Israel. So I want to give you a few samples just to get a sense for how these folks talk, and then I'll have a couple final thoughts, and then we'll have lots of room for Q&A, hopefully. So this is just to illustrate this point about Islam as a demonic force in certain U.S. locales. So these two clips, they both come from an NAR spiritual warfare campaign led by a prophet named Lou Engle, very prominent leader in the NAR, actually a very prominent NAR figure globally. And Lou Engle's this guy on the right. And it was focused on Detroit in the Dearborn area, one of the most concentrated communities of Muslims in the U.S. And so they organized this kind of spiritual warfare campaign that rolls out over a couple of years, but it was especially centered around 2011. So the first clip, this is an NAR activist named Anita Christopher explaining to a group at a conference what they're going to do when they get to Detroit.
After lunch, we're coming back to the facility, and then we will, for those who want to do this, we will be doing some teaching on what the strong man over this is, and we do believe, as do many of the prophetic and apostolic people, that Baal is the strong man over our country and directly the strong man over Islam and Freemasonry. So we will be teaching about Baal and then using strategy that we have been given to go to mosque to do this strategy and to pray right on site. It's not going to be prayer walking. It's going to be really prayer driving. And we will have maps and directions and the strategy after we've been set free ourselves from Freemasonry and from Islamic influence. Then we can go then and tear down, like Gideon did, the Ashtoreth poles, the groves that have set up false worship in our state. So we'll just be doing that close around where we're meeting over in the Dearborn area. And
all right, so as you can hear in there, in their imagination, Islam is often conceived of as a form of paganism and of demon worship. right? Here, the pagan deity Baal from the ancient Canaanites. And then Muslim buildings and Muslim communities are strongholds of demonic influence and false worship within the U.S. that must be physically encircled with prayer and ultimately cast out. Okay, so and then this is a clip from Lou Engle, the organizer of this campaign, and it's several different clips kind of chained together of how he talked about Islam in the lead up to this campaign.
I'm saying, God, no, not here. America is saying, Muslims are saying by the year 2050, America is going to be Islamic nation. Something in my spirit says that is not an empty statement. It's actually a statement of spiritual intent. The church must raise up a house of prayer to contend with Islam. Raise up a 24/7 house of prayer. Muslim proclamations for 1400 years have been fueling the demonic realm. Give us a generation like that who said, God, we have to have you or the Muslims are going to have their day. Give us the Muslims. Give us the strongholds of Islam. The gates of hell will not prevail.
So again, you get a sense there, right? Muslim proclamations for 1400 years. They believe that Muslim prayers do have a spiritual impact. It's an impact in the demonic realm. So Muslim prayers fuel the demonic realm and signal a Muslim intent to take over America. Now, this next slide is to illustrate this idea of Islam as a modern manifestation of an ancient territorial spirit. So this is Dutch Sheets. He's an NAR apostle and prophet, very involved in January 6th, very influential guy in the U.S. And this clip is from a few days after October 7th, 2023. So after Hamas's attack on Israel, slaughtering innocent Israelis, as Israel is invading Gaza, Dutch Sheets on his daily podcast says this.
I've been feeling, as have others, that we have moved into the season that God is going to bring judgment against this prince of Persia. You know, these spirits don't die. Same prince of Iran or Persia. Persia is today's Iran, ancient Persia. This spirit that has been ruling in that region for centuries, millennia. And I believe God is going to deal a tremendous blow of judgment. I don't know if he will demolish the spirit or do away with it once and for all, but its hold on that region is going to be dealt with in this hour. And I've been saying that. Others have been saying it. I said it last year, and I wasn't at all surprised when this war broke out in the Middle East, because I have known that it's not the people of Iran. God is not against it. He loves the people of Iran. Revival is taking place, in a sense, in Iran. I said last year, and as far as I know, it's still true today, the greatest number of people being saved anywhere of late, the last several years, it has been in Iran. Well, there's revival coming to the entire Middle East. I'm confident of it. And of course, that will include, at some point soon, I believe, Israel. But God has to deal with this spirit that is involved in controlling circumstances, keeping people blinded to truth, working to keep the gospel out, working to destroy Israel and wanting to destroy America, calling Israel little Satan, America big Satan. I believe the hatred of this spirit and Satan and his kingdom is because God raised up Israel to give us Messiah, to redeem the earth. God raised up America to trumpet that message throughout the ends of the earth. It's not that he loves America more than any place else, but he did raise up this nation to trumpet the gospel to the earth. And because Israel gave us the Messiah and America preaches Messiah, the message of the gospel, has done so more than any other nation, we are hated by the kingdom of darkness. This spirit in the Middle East hates Israel and America. Well, we know that.
So as you can hear, for Sheets, right, the Israel and America are entwined. They have these entwined destinies in God's plan. And here, this is modern prophecy speak. He's not getting this whole America as a nation destined by God stuff from the Bible. This is coming out of prophecies that they have. And Islam as a particular religion, right, with the five pillars and daily prayer, right? All the elements of Islam kind of recede into the background of this general demonology and this demonic framing. He's not even interested in theologically debating with Islam. It's just a manifestation of these millennia old demons in the Middle East. And then the Prince of Persia is manifesting through Iran and Hamas and arguably Hezbollah. I don't think Hezbollah had entered the war at this point yet. But that demon can be defeated through Israeli aggression, through pushing back in the real world against some of these people. And then the revival, including in Israel, right, of Israelis converting to Christianity, of Jews converting to Christianity, is God's agenda, but the demons keep getting in the way. So the spiritual warriors have to fight back against that. All right, last clip here. This is Cindy Jacobs, arguably the most important of the NAR prophets, right-hand prophet to Peter Wagner. And here we're talking about Islam as a subversive anti-American movement that aims to disrupt the U.S. alliance with Israel. So in April of 2024, Cindy Jacobs gathered the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, one of the older NAR networks of prophets, so that was set up in the late 1990s. And she claimed that she had an emergency revelation from God. And she checked it with all the other prophets and they agreed. And so she got up on YouTube and delivered this kind of emergency briefing, a tearful emergency briefing about what is going on with pro-Palestinian protesters against the war in Gaza.
Word of the Lord for the nations. Do not think that the people who are protesting and calling for a Palestinian state are just protesting on behalf of Palestine. Whether they understand or not, there is an insurrection forming that is like unto the communist takeover in Russia for the downfall of the czars. Only this time, they are aiming for the nations of Canada, the U.S., and the nations of the world. Among the other nations, Europe is especially a target. This is a planned takeover, not only ideologically, but nationally. It has infiltrated militaries and is gaining strength. At the moment, they are quietly planning. There are proxies on the streets and protests. This is not only about bringing a Palestinian state to the Middle East, but an Islamic state to North America and other nations. They are subversive and even using misguided students, but the movement is on a much bigger and more pervasive scale. The insurrectionists are set in Paris, London, and other European cities, as well as in Australia and Latin America. However, the hand of God is waiting to cover those nations who are on their face in repentance and holiness.
So here, prophets have special insight into the supposed fifth column nature of Muslims in the US and Europe. That they might look like they're just protesting on behalf of the people of Palestine, but really their agenda is to take over the government of all of these Western nations. And right, so the pro-Palestinians are really insurrectionists. I'll just note, Cindy Jacobs herself was there on January 6th, participated in the insurrection, was leading spiritual warfare that day. But here, the pro-Palestinian protesters have become the insurrectionists, and God will protect and prevent these Islamist takeovers only if the West remains prayerful and tacitly pro-Israel. So let me wrap up here, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So this theological demonization of Islam and Muslims has very real world consequences. These are the advisors who surround Donald Trump, at least the religious advisors. And what have we seen so far in the second Trump administration vis-a-vis Islam and Muslims? We've seen further travel bans, expanding upon what happened in his first term, mostly targeted at Muslim countries. We've seen a crackdown on pro-Palestinian college protesters and a deportation of Muslim international students. This was going on throughout the beginning of the Trump administration, especially in early 2025. We've seen an enforcement against anti-Semitism and anti-Christian bias in the U.S. In fact, they've created whole task forces to battle against anti-Semitism and anti-Christian bias. 63% of Americans are Christian. Hard to imagine there's a lot of anti-Christian bias, but Islamophobia gets a free pass. There is no initiative to combat Islamophobia. In fact, they encourage it. We are watching bombing operations going on in Nigeria today to protect Christians from supposed Muslim attacks. In fact, the situation on the ground in Nigeria is incredibly complicated, and there are rivalries between kind of the mobile herders, the folks who are moving around with their flocks versus the farmers, and those conflicts, economic and tribal, have spilled over into violence. But the Trump administration, advised by these folks, have said that is Christian persecution, and the U.S. government needs to intervene on behalf of the Nigerian Christians. We're watching unflagging support for Israel, especially in the midst of the war in Gaza. And now we have the 12-day war, the bombing of Iran last year, and now an ongoing war against Iran with extremist Christians in the government, including people like Pete Hegseth, who has multiple tattoos referencing the Crusades and identifying himself as a crusader on his body. He is the Secretary of Defense who gives the briefings for the war in Iran. All of this is very much in sync with what the NAR and other Christian supremacist movements around Trump want, right? I think they are largely driving the agenda, the Islamophobia agenda of the U.S. So what are the implications for the Muslims in the U.S. and abroad? And we'll close with this. These frames that we're dealing with here are both very old and very new. They're very old Christian, Islamophobic, and polemical tropes that are getting refracted through modern prophecy and charismatic spiritual warfare theology, right? So the accusations, paganism and Muslim prayers are to demons, all of that stuff is very old. But now it's getting refracted through these very modern frames and amplified through the kind of media infrastructure that exists around these folks. And unlike more anti-Semitic elements of the Christian far right, and there really are some anti-Semitic elements of the Christian far right in America, this is a philo-Semitic version of Christian nationalism that is staunchly pro-Israel for Christian theological reasons. They're not pro-Jewish, they're pro-Israel. And this Pentecostal charismatic Christianity is actually growing around the world and becoming more predominant in places with large or growing Muslim populations, including in Latin America, in Africa, and the Asian Pacific region. So this chart here, this is again from the Center for the Study of World Christianity, is showing the global distribution of charismatics and Pentecostals. North America is not the center of this stuff. It's centered in the global South. And I worry that we are going to see increasing tensions between Muslim communities and charismatic Christian communities as this demon language becomes more and more infused around the world in these charismatic communities. And last and final point, the global demographic reality that we're facing right now. We're approaching a moment in which Muslims will probably outnumber Christians, right? Right now, the chart from the Pew Research Center, Christians are going to roughly stay at around 32% of the world population. Muslims are rapidly growing. And by 2050, the expectation is that those lines might cross. And the Muslim population will outpace the Christian population. But this runs totally counter to the NAR narrative of charismatic revival and global revival and Christianity growing in influence. And I think it could lead to further hostility and aggression from Christians towards Muslims.